Right. Welcome to another episode of Curricular Bites. I'm Dr. Waslick, and I'm joined today with Dr. Helfenbein from Mercer University, and we are going to go ahead and get into it. Thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me and thanks for doing this. I think it's a great project.
Thank you. All right. So, can you talk a little bit about how you define curriculum studies?
Well, curriculum studies is a pretty big thing that I think has some subfields that are pretty important.
Okay.
That would include things like curriculum theorizing, curriculum history, curriculum evaluation, curriculum creation. Those types of things are all underneath this big umbrella called curriculum studies. I think at its most basic, what we're trying to understand within that big umbrella of curriculum studies is what is the what of education, right? So what is it that we are trying to impart in an educative context? I say educative context on purpose. Um, and I can talk about that in a second. But I think most people think we're primarily talking about schooling, classrooms, classroom teachers, kind of historically as the place where curriculum lives. Coming out of a tradition of curriculum theorizing, I think it's a little bigger than that. And actually, a lot of my own work has been on educative spaces that are not formal schools, that I think are quite important, often in the basement of churches or after school programs or underneath a tree in Mississippi in 1964. Education happens in lots of places. And so I think that's worth our curricular study as well. I do think if we have to put some bounds on it, which does seem smart, otherwise we have kind of the critique of if it's everything, then it's nothing, right? But I think part of when you invoke the idea of curriculum is you're invoking a sense of intent, right? That there is some type of intent that we're trying to teach some other, right? Now, even that needs to be troubled almost automatically because I think what, again, a lot of curriculum theorizing has pointed to is that intent can be subconscious. That intent, we may not be fully aware, right, of what it is that what we are trying to do, or in fact doing in the doing of it, right? So that's got to be troubled almost right off the bat too. But I do think intent is a key part of how we think about curriculum in any kind of educative space. How's that?
It's helpful. So, if you can talk a little bit about curriculum theorizing and this idea of the reconceptualization movements,
Yeah.
and the relationship there, that would be incredibly helpful as well.
Yeah, sure. So I uh, come by it honest, I'd like to say. And my first class in curriculum theory was with Madeline Grumet, who many folks know as being a central part of the reconceptualization, with other really important scholars like Janet Miller, Bill Pinar, being kind of key in that list. But there's others that are around, and it's Michael Apple and Tom Popkowitz and Jose Rosario, who gets forgotten, I think sometimes. But Patty Lather and Deborah Britzman, and so there's a long list of really important folks that were involved in this thing called the reconceptualization. And at its, again, kind of simplest, very complex thing, but at its simplest, the idea was we'd spent so much time and energy in curriculum studies in creating curriculum and then evaluating curriculum. And the world was rapidly changing in the late 60s and 70s, and a lot of theoretical uh, openings were happening across the social sciences, across philosophy and social theory. And it felt like or curriculum studies was not attending to those new openings. And so again, at its simplest, I think the reconceptualization was perhaps we pause on the creating and evaluating. I would note that if you read those original writing, those writing and documents and publications, they never say we shouldn't do it, but it is kind of a maybe we pause on the creating and evaluating and really refocus to understanding, right? And so how do we understand curriculum as a function of a set of much larger forces that are sociological, that are cultural, that are economic, that are reflective and resistant of forces of patriarchy, sexism, homophobia, ableism, all of the things are in some way wrapped up in what we come to call curriculum. And it might be in our interest to try to understand that as how those things work as part of this pause in the traditional work of curriculum studies.
So, talk to me a little bit about our contemporary era, right? I mean, schools no longer ask educators to engage deeply in curriculum, right? And I know that this is something you've been thinking about quite a bit. And it's not necessarily saying that a K-12 teacher should be engaging in the work of curriculum theorizing. I'm not trying to say that's the argument here, um, or maybe they should, right? But talk to me a little bit about how you feel in this current socio-political landscape, where curriculum studies, curriculum theory should sit, and what that might mean.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to try to cover a couple things to get at that. So rein me back in if you need to. Um, First of all, one of the things that I point out to students when they read a lot of the reconceptualist curriculum theorizing is there's an edge to it, right? There is an edge to it. And particularly as you move throughout time, it gets even edgier, right? And part of it is the original writings were kind of prophetic, right? In a sense of we see things going in a particular direction. And if we're not careful, here's where it's going to go. And here's what we're going to lose. But then once we get into the 80s and the 90s, these same scholars are like, we told you this was coming, and here it is. And that's why Pinar's phrase is so compelling, at least to me, is the nightmare of the present, right? Is all of those things that in the early days were kind of said, look, this is going in a rough direction. I don't know if we want it to go here, but it looks like it might. Almost all of those things happen. And it then becomes a nightmare of the present, right? When we take a look at what's happening in schools today. Although there's some wonderful things, I still believe in the power of teachers and the power of moments. I've called it a pathology of hope that I suffer from. You may be familiar, but it's a pretty much a nightmare. And you're right. And I'm old enough at this point to where I participated in some curriculum writing activities, both as a teacher when I was a high school teacher, but then also as an emerging young academic who was brought in with a room full of, I think, 100 teachers. And we worked on a world geography curriculum in Indiana, right? And these were highly lauded high school level teachers who said, these are the experts that we should be depending on, right? Or learning from, or taking advantage of their, expertise and their day-to-day work in classrooms. And that I did that work, right? So one, while I am feeling old, that's not that long ago, right? That's really not that long ago. And that has shifted, right? Funding has been taken away from the state professional organizations, which again, when I was a teacher, both middle school teacher and high school teacher, were very active and really generative, right? And when I first started working with teachers, my advice was get involved in those professional organizations. It's going to fire you up. You're going to come back with new ideas and new things to try, right? And different ways to approach your own curriculum in the classroom. So it really, it saw the teacher as part of that curricular project, right? So that's one thing. You're right. We almost never, it almost doesn't exist. For all practical purposes, it doesn't exist. And again, that's just over the course of my career, right? As I've seen that shift. Now, one thing I wanted to say, I know part of what you're trying to get at here in some of the things that you've shared with me is, why curriculum studies? Why curriculum theory? Why is it important? And I will tell you that another piece of this is in my experience in teaching graduate level courses to in-service teachers. When it's taught, I can only speak to how I do it, right? And so I don't know how to not do it that in a way that isn't deeply reflected from a reconceptualist curriculum theorizing perspective. I don't know how to do it. Well, I guess I probably could, but it would probably bore me to death. And so I do what I do, right? And in that experience, teachers tell me this was not the least useful. They often tell me this was the most useful course, right, of this graduate degree, because I hadn't thought about the curricular aspects of the work of teaching. And I certainly hadn't thought about them in the ways in which curriculum theory nudges us to think about it, right? And that was my experience. And again, I'll shout it out again, right? But my entire career, my entire academic trajectory shifted when I took one class with Madeline Grimet. Because what I always say, and I've said it other places, is that class, that introduction to curriculum theory, gave me language for what I felt in my gut about what was important about education. And that kind of embodied reaction I'm bringing up on purpose, right? Why we do this work of teaching, right? Which again is another lesson or a curriculum tool, right? Is to think about our participation in the curricular project. We're in it, right? We're not neutral, right? In any educative moment, right? And in fact, we are part of the curriculum, right? And so what that means is, it seems like from a curriculum theory perspective, is that there needs to be some introspection. We need to be thinking about the ways in which we're engaged in that curricular work, what we're bringing into the room, right? Again, sometimes very intentionally, sometimes not so intentionally, sometimes a little bit under the surface. But just as students are bringing their whole selves into the room, we as teachers are bringing our whole selves into the room. And what's actually happening is what someone like David Flinders would call the enacted curriculum, right? That's actually worth studying, which I was very deeply influenced by also being trained as a qualitative researcher. Because the only way you get at an enacted curriculum is you got to go see it, right? You got to sit in the back of the room and watch it. And then you got to go talk to a teacher and maybe talk to some kids like, what just happened? How do you make sense of that? Right? That to me is really, really useful work. And then to circle back, right, that's the type of thing that teachers tell me, I hadn't thought about it that way before. And it feels really important that I do. Right? And I didn't say the word, but the other piece of that is the ethics of it, right? Is that if we are in fact bringing selves, right, maybe multiple, maybe contradictory, who knows, over the course of a 55-minute social studies lesson, right, which selves we bring into the room, right? But if we're doing that and that is impacting what's being enacted, what's happening, then it seems to me there's no other way than to frame this as an ethical question. Am I making the right decisions? Right? Did I make the right decision today in third period? Maybe I didn't. Maybe I need to think about that for tomorrow, right? In this interaction with this young woman who's trying to figure out not just social studies, but how to be in the world, right? So I do think it leads us necessarily to an ethic. And that's theorizing.
Really beautiful. Thank you. And so I'm wondering,
Felt a little bit more.
as we do. So I am wondering then about your scholarly contributions to the field. So when we think about the selves that we bring, curriculum theorizing is inherently this interdisciplinary work. I think that's one of the more interesting
Thank you.
things about curriculum scholars is that it's not just thinking about one idea for an entire career. It's the fact of being able to fold in multiple perspectives from fields and things like that. And so as you think about the self that you've brought to this field over the last just couple of years, um, talk to me a little bit about your contributions.
Okay. Well, thank you, because I didn't close that circle, or as they say. That then what the reconceptualization said is we should be reading broadly outside of education
Yeah.
to see what those ideas and new directions and openings can bring to our analysis of what we're calling curriculum studies. And so that's really the second move of the reconceptualization. One is we should try to understand curriculum. Two is how we're going to do that. We're going to read outside. So what's happening in feminism? What's happening in, dare I say, Marxism, right? Or psychoanalytic work, or critical race theory, or whatever it might be? What's happening in those places that might inform what we're doing? And for me, it was reading in critical geographies, which tied back to some master's work I did in geography that blew my mind about different ways to think about space and place, and ended up being profoundly relevant in my dissertation work. And people don't believe me, but actually in ways I didn't anticipate. I didn't set out to do a critical geography dissertation. That's what it ended up being. um, so, right, it has always been that type of project. For me, again, being trained as a qualitative researcher, trained as an ethnographer, within the post-critical tradition via George Noblet and some other important scholars. Not that we have to talk about that, but and also cultural studies, I think is, I thought about this in anticipation for our conversation. It's really hard for me to think about curriculum theorizing outside of a cultural studies frame. Um, and I see them as sister projects. And I think the only difference might be curriculum theorizing has this kind of very named educative context as its object of analysis, right? Whereas cultural studies might not. Cultural studies might be bigger than that. The other, though, I think cultural studies is a little better about naming its work as an explicitly political project. And you see that in some curriculum work and sometimes not in others. So that is to say, I got very interested in questions of equity and oppression and marginalization, particularly how they played out around lines of race and class. Being that urban education was and always has been, I taught in urban high school, I've always been an urban ed person. And so what became pretty evident was the ways in which space and place was deployed in order to either enable or constrain certain things in educative contexts. And those are not just things like achievement or outcomes, but opportunities, right? A mentor of mine, Lawrence Grossberg, used to say, the geography or power is always about geography because it's always about access, right? So power is about access. And so if you start thinking about the ways in which, and I also have talked a lot about what I would call scalar analysis of moving across scales, which at one point was taboo in geography. You have to keep one scale to do one analysis. But in kind of more recent, more kind of posty analyses. Scalar means you do multiple scales, kind of like the aperture of a camera, because we're looking for connections, right? So you can look at classroom spaces, right, and see, well, who's getting the teacher's attention and how is that spatially organized, right? Who is in the corner, right, and maybe not causing a ruckus, but clearly not engaged, right? And the spatiality of that enables the opportunities afforded, the engagement that's even possible. Then you can look at school buildings themselves. And of course, I taught in a time of what was called second generation segregation, whereas in terms of race, also class, right? But the school was segregated within the walls of the school, right? It wasn't that we had, and this is back in North Carolina, black high schools and white high schools. It wasn't that type of segregation. Those were desegregated, but within the building, because of things like AP courses, honors courses, disciplinary procedures, access to special education, both as support structure for students, but also as tool for marginalization. What we see is kind of school within a school and not in a good way, right? And so what we see then is a kind of a spatial ordering of the building itself. From there, you can go and take a look at districts. You can look at the ways in which districts resisted desegregation. It's been a big part of my work, of every city that I've lived in, and kind of studying deeply, well, what's the history of desegregation? And then what does that look like spatially? And again, spatially has a lot to do with access. And again, a critical geography thinks about what do spatial forces enable and what do they constrain. And so we often see in desegregation histories that kind of play out in very particular ways, interestingly, in different ways, in different urban contexts. And then we could keep going from there. We could think about national policy. We could think about global policy, which I have thought about quite a bit. These kind of global demands on education, where education is framed as not just comparative advantage, but actually national security, right? And so we've seen that in the Nation at Risk. We've seen it in many a politician's speech, that this education issue is a matter of national security. Fill in the blank, whoever that is historically, is beating us at math and science. Okay. So it's framed in those kind of terms. That's a set of global relations that are spatial. Last thing is, and I think I need to write more about this, right? But in a lot of folks are calling for more of an embodied understanding of the relationship of teaching and learning. And I think what is kind of implied, but rarely explicitly talked about, is that if we're going to talk about bodies, bodies exist in spaces. Bodies are necessarily spatial, right? And so if we're going to talk about embodiment, and we're going to talk about whether it's interrelation or intra-relation, however we want to frame that, we're still talking about bodies in relation in space. And to me, there's room to write about that, right? And to think a little harder about how those things kind of play out, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And I'm just wondering, although not necessarily the topic for Curricular Bites, since you're talking about the relationship between curriculum studies and cultural studies, I know that many times folks have this misunderstanding about what is the cultural studies project. Could you talk really briefly about that, just for our listeners who are thinking about understanding those intersections?
Briefly, she says.
She does,
So,
yes.
well, I've thought a lot about this, and I've thought a lot about this in particular with my friend and colleague Gabe Huddleston. Right, we've been thinking about cultural studies of education, and in fact, kind of in a way of, well, where did it go? Because when I started in grad school, as in a PhD program, cultural studies of education was everywhere. Like when you went to ARA, the hot session was cultural studies, right? Standing room only very often, right? And so that was very much the thing, right? And so, in particular with scholars like Patty Lather, Greg Demetriadis, Handel Wright, um, Brownwin Davis, others, right? I'm sure I'm forgetting important people, but that were kind of speaking very directly to a cultural studies that specifically came out of the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies with Stuart Hall. And it was Kathy Hinton actually was a major player in early writings about cultural studies of education, and very helpful to me as I was trying to get up to speed on that. So I want to make sure she gets thanked for that. So the question is, well, what's the connection, right? So cultural studies, one, it comes out of sociology. And frankly, a dissatisfaction with sociology's tendency to theorize about how the larger social world was understood by the popular or the masses, right? But they weren't very comfortable with going and talking to those people. Right? Cultural studies says, well, maybe we can theorize about it. Sure, that's probably useful, but maybe we should go ask them, right? It actually started as something called audience theory, right? And what came out of that was realizing that people are a lot more savvy about power structures and systems of oppression and marginalization than often we give them credit. And so that's a fundamental understanding within cultural studies, is we need to spend time to try to understand how people are making sense, right, of the world in particular ways. It also claims a specifically political project, right? It is about working against systems of oppression, systems of marginalization, and working to try to understand that. And I think in particular, I'm going to try to do this, the connection with cultural studies and curriculum theorizing is, again, a statement by one of my mentors, Larry Grossberg, is we have to move away from the logic of power and towards the power of the logic. And what he means by that is what a lot of critical social work did was kind of pointing to, look, this is how power works. Look, there's power. Power's working over here. Power's working over here. And that's true, right? And valuable. But what Grossberg is offering is that we probably need to do a better job of the power of the logic, meaning how does this meaning-making process at work on people? And then how does the logic work? How does it hold? And so if someone has this thinking about public education, let's say, right? How did that come to be? How does the logic get constructed? And the idea is if we can understand that, then perhaps we can get to a political project of constructing something otherwise. Now, it's very hard for me not to see that idea, the power of the logic. It's very hard for me not to see that as curriculum. Right? So I've written about this a couple places, right? But we learn many things. But one of the big things we learned from the feminist movement is that the personal is political, right? And what I want to offer is that the political is also pedagogical. Now, I like the alliteration of the P's, but I guess what I really mean is the political is curricular. Right? A politician is trying to teach you something. Trying to teach you something, right? Whether it's about income tax, whether it's about defense spending, whether it's about Medicaid, right? Or why we can't fix that pothole, right? They're trying to teach you something. Now, what cultural studies tells us is that effort to teach us something isn't guaranteed. It can be accepted, it could be rejected, or it could be negotiated, right? And that people are more savvy. There's more options to that. But again, any political action, right, is an effort to teach us. It's curricular. So, for example, we have right now in the state of Georgia, we have a billionaire who's the Republican nominee for governor. What he's offered in his plan is that he's going to freeze he's going to freeze income tax now, and then he is going to cut in half property tax, and in 4 years he wants to eliminate property tax. Right? Now, if you think your taxes are too high, and it's expensive, I live in Atlanta. Atlanta's a very expensive place to live, right? You can hear that and say, oh, wow, okay, wow, that's something. But what you may not know is that if that were to happen, that's over 70% of school funding for the whole state of Georgia. It would be the most destructive, if he was to pull that off, as stated, it would be the most destructive effort for Georgia public schools in our history. I don't think that's part of the conversation. And I do think there's a political project to start saying, maybe this should be part of the conversation. And by the way, we're not even at the mean nationally if we're looking at things like NAEP scores or reading and that. We don't want to get into all those metrics, right? But it's not like we're killing it, right? Here in Georgia, and you want to gut it. So two things. And that's what's important, is there's no guarantees in this, right? Is one, that candidate for governor is trying to teach the people of Georgia that this is a good thing. And this is why you should vote for me. So one, we should understand how that logic. Two, there's a political project of resistance saying, yeah, here's why that's not a good thing. Right. And we should help folks understand that political logic as best as we can. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's incredibly helpful. Thank you.
That's another example of how curriculum can be as granular as how are you feeling today when you walk into third period world geography, right? Not to bias the social studies or language arts or science or whatever it is. That's pretty granular, right? How's third period going to go, right? That's a curriculum question. Or state level politics, which is actually tied very closely to national politics, right? And how that's going to impact this lived experience of schools. That's another Pienarism, right? When talking about curriculum theory is the interdisciplinary study of the lived experience of schools. Well, if you take away 70% of the funding for the state of Georgia, the lived experience of schools is going to be drastically impacted. Yes. No question. Therefore, seems to me to be a curriculum question.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you very much for taking the extra detour there with us. Sure. So for our last question here today, is just asking you, what is one thing that you hope for the future of the field?
Well, I think curriculum studies and curriculum theorizing in particular has a lot to offer educational research as a whole. Not to mention the project of teacher education, principal education, further graduate education. I think we have a lot to offer. It's something that Walter Gershon and I called curriculum tools in that piece called Curriculum Matters. I think we have a lot to offer that is useful and hopefully impactful. And I am concerned that we seem to be losing, we are losing some grip. And I'm worried that we often aren't fighting for ourselves, right? And fighting for the field and having a sense of responsibility, stewardship even, for the field and for the next generation. This isn't new, right? I've never been in a moment where we didn't feel like we were under attack in some degree. But what's troubling is to see something like curriculum studies under attack within colleges of education, right? Where curriculum courses are being eliminated, majors are being eliminated, doctoral programs, right, are closing. Worse than that is folks that aren't from curriculum studies being assigned courses in curriculum studies. which I think is diluting the field, right? And I want to be somewhat careful about this point. It is not to say that my colleagues and other scholars and all around the country don't have something to say to the question of curriculum, but I am quite worried about what seems to be a trend in dismissing the idea of expertise. And I think it's an incredibly short-sighted and foolish move, right? In part because if you think that somehow you'll be protected, that your expertise will be respected at the end of the day, right? In the final analysis, right? If you think that, I think you're being foolish. And I understand why there are budgetary constraints at work and how hard decisions have to be made. I understand that. But if we are willing to give up the idea of expertise, we are ultimately shooting ourselves in the foot because you are jeopardizing your own sense of expertise, if that makes sense. And so what that I think would require is some courage.
Yeah.
And what's happened at moments like this within the field is what we've pushed on. I've been part of this, full disclosure, right? Is a lot of colleagues of my generation are now deans and associate deans and provosts and assistant provosts and directors and all the department heads and all the different things that we have in academia. Are those, when those folks make that move, are they fighting to maintain curriculum studies as a legitimate field of study that has legitimate markers of expertise to really do the work in ways that I think matters and is impactful? We did that. We have been doing that. I don't know how successful. That's a different question. But we made that call multiple times. Right? Now I think we have to even go a little bit further, right? And really challenge people to kind of stand up and make the hard decisions of raising, even if you're asked to teach that class, right? Of having the courage to say, yeah, I should not be teaching this. I don't have the expertise for this. And I worry, I feel like that was responded to differently than it is now. When it's being raised now, people look at me like I'm crazy. They don't even understand the argument. I mean, I had to teach a course on assessment, and I was like, yeah, I'm not qualified to teach that, right? And also, I don't think you want me to teach that. I don't think I'm going to teach what you want me to teach, and I didn't, and it didn't work. They still gave me the course, but what was more troubling, and I taught it in a very critical. It was hard to do because you can't deconstruct something that hasn't been constructed. So I had to do a bit of both. But I'm sure if the powers that be knew the way I taught that, they wouldn't be necessarily happy. But what troubled me the most was literally the blank stares and the idea that I can't understand what you're saying. That what do you mean you're not qualified to teach a graduate level course in assessment? And like there are people with expertise here, right? And well, yeah, I need to make load. I need to I need to keep my job, right? But don't we have people that are experts in assessment, so they should teach the course. The faculty has decided this is part of the program of study. We could debate that. We could. There's processes for that. But right now, it's part of the program. And so someone that actually has expertise, right, in assessment should be teaching that course, not me. Even though it was pretty fun to take it apart. But
no, it's a valid point because we wouldn't expect it of other professions, right? If there is an electrical problem in my house, I'm not going to call a plumber. If I need a cardiothoracic surgeon, I'm not going to go to a podiatrist or a dentist, right? I mean, there are lots of fields in the trades and in other types of professions that we're very clear about expertise and how it matters, but education tends to ignore that or water down what expertise can mean. And so I really appreciate that point. I think it's an incredibly
Yeah.
helpful one to hang on to for the future of the field. Absolutely.
Well, and part of what I shouldn't say too much, right? But I probably already have. But part of the justification was accreditation, right? And so the accreditation um, body doesn't see that as a problem, right? And so that was the answer that was given. And of course, my response was that's the ethical bar that that's our bar. What the state of Georgia accrediting body said, like, it seems to me like that's the floor, not the ceiling. It's the bare. I've always thought that about standardization, accreditation, all of that. That is the floor. Let's build the house on top of this with a whole different set of ethical obligations, understandings about what might be important, right, in what we do within this work. Not that that's the ceiling. Well, it's good enough for the creditors, then it's good enough for us. What kind of answer is that? It's one that's dismissive of expertise. And it's just, and you're right. And actually, it's not just I love that. It was a great example of the plumber and the electrician, but you better be damn sure it doesn't happen over in the School of Medicine. That doesn't happen in the School of Medicine. I'll go ahead and teach it. They'll be fine.
Yeah, no, it is a problem that we continue to face. And so I think that's a very good note to end on today. How we think
Sure, I can keep going.
you can keep going. Yes, I have no doubt about that. And I would actually continue to listen. And I'm sure our listeners might too. And so, as always, there'll be some information in the description with more of Dr. Helfenbein's work if you want to follow up. As a reminder, Curriculum Bites is just a start of our journey. And so there is a body of work out there, not the least of which has been produced by Dr. Helfenbein during his career that I encourage you to check out. And I look forward to you all joining us next time. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Take care.